My parents took me to court over my dead grandfather's house. The same house I lived in for 6 years, fixed up with my own money, and was legally left to me in a notarized will. They had lawyers. They had a plan. What they didn't have was any idea what I'd already done to prepare. I'm 31, male, work in IT, nothing fancy. Average guy, decent income, no drama, or at least that's how my life used to read. I grew up watching my grandfather be quietly dismissed by my parents. He was the kind of man who fixed things with duct tape and said fine when he meant hurt. They saw him as an inconvenience after my grandmother died. I saw him as the only adult who ever actually showed up for me. When I was 25, my grandfather asked me to move in with him. He was 78, still sharp, but the house needed work and he needed company. My parents thought it was a waste of my time. "You're going to throw your 20s away playing caretaker?" my father said. I moved in anyway. Over the next 6 years, I paid to fix the roof, replace the HVAC, repainted the whole interior, and built a deck in the backyard. I have every receipt. My grandfather watched me work, and one evening, sitting on that new deck, he said, "I'm putting the house in your name when I go. You earned it." I told him I didn't need a reward for being family. He said, "That's exactly why you're getting it." He worked with an estate attorney and updated his will. The house was to go directly to me. He also signed a transfer on death deed, which in our state means the property transfers automatically upon death. No probate required. He passed 18 months later, peacefully, in his own bed. I was there. The funeral was on a Tuesday. By Thursday, my parents were asking about the will. "He had to have left something for us," my mother said, standing in the kitchen of the house she hadn't visited in 4 years. Not a question. A declaration. My father nodded behind her like a backup singer. "Your grandfather would have wanted the family taken care of." The word family doing a lot of heavy lifting there, considering neither of them had called him more than twice a year. I told them calmly that the house had already transferred to me via the TOD deed and that the will confirmed his intentions. My mother's expression shifted in a way I'd seen before, that slow recalibration when entitlement meets an obstacle it didn't expect. She smiled and said, "We'll see." I didn't think much of it. I should have. 2 months later, I received a certified letter. My parents had filed a civil lawsuit contesting the will and the TOD deed, claiming my grandfather lacked testamentary capacity when he made those decisions and that I had unduly influenced him. Undue influence. As if making a man dinner and fixing his gutters was some kind of psychological warfare. Their attorney sent a demand letter alongside it. They wanted the house sold, and the proceeds split 3 ways. Equal shares. For the people who showed up at Christmas twice in 6 years and left early both times. The legal term for what they were attempting is a will contest, and in our state, they had a window of about a year from the date of death to file. They used almost every day of it. Methodical. Planned. This wasn't grief talking, this was a strategy. "We just want what's fair," my mother told me over the phone. Her voice had that practiced softness that people use when they want to sound reasonable while being completely unreasonable. "You got to live there rent-free for years." "I paid for every repair," I said. "I have documentation." "That was your choice," she said. "Nobody forced you. I want you to sit with that for a second. Nobody forced you." As if investing in a person's home and life was some kind of mistake I should be embarrassed about. As if love was a transaction that only counted if it came with a receipt they approved of. I told her I'd see her in court. Not dramatically, just factually. And then I called my own attorney. My attorney was a no-nonsense estate litigation specialist I found through a referral. She had handled dozens of will contests, and when I laid everything out, the TOD deed, the attorney-drafted will, my documentation of every repair, my grandfather's medical records showing full cognitive clarity up until 8 months before his death, she looked at me across the conference table and said, "They don't have a case. But that won't stop them from making your life difficult for a while." She was right on both counts. The first dirty trick came fast. My parents' attorney filed a lease pendens on the property, a legal notice that clouds the title and essentially freezes any sale or refinancing while litigation is pending. It's a legitimate legal tool, and also a weapon when used to apply pressure. I couldn't sell, couldn't refinance, couldn't do anything with the house while the cloud hung over it. Their hope was that the financial and emotional strain would make me want to settle. Split the proceeds, make it go away, move on. My attorney filed a motion to expunge the lease pendens, arguing it was filed without probable cause. That process took about 60 days. In the meantime, I kept every document organized, kept my composure, and stopped taking my parents' calls. My father escalated. He started calling my workplace. Not to cause a scene, just to check in with people who knew me, casually mentioning the lawsuit, planting seeds. One of my coworkers mentioned it to me with visible discomfort. "Your dad called here asking for your supervisor." Dark humor was the only way I survived that week. I told my coworker, "Don't worry, he's just trying to destroy my life." Very normal family stuff. Then came the character attack. Their attorney submitted a declaration from a neighbor, a woman my grandfather hadn't spoken to warmly in years, claiming she had observed me controlling my grandfather's visitors and isolating him from family. It was fabricated in tone, if not entirely in fact. Yes, I had once told that neighbor that my grandfather was resting and couldn't talk. He had asked me to. He didn't like her. My attorney deposed her. Under oath, the story collapsed within 20 minutes. She admitted she hadn't been inside the house in over 2 years. She admitted my grandfather had told her directly, on more than one occasion, that he appreciated my help. The declaration evaporated. My parents didn't attend that deposition. They were letting their attorney run the operation while they kept their hands clean. Smart in a calculated way. Cowardly in a human way. The TOD deed was the cornerstone of my defense. In our state, a transfer on death deed is non-probate and passes property outside the will entirely. To challenge it, they needed to prove either forgery, lack of capacity at the time of signing, or undue influence, so severe it constituted fraud. The deed had been signed 3 years before my grandfather's death, witnessed by 2 people and notarized, with the estate attorney present. My grandfather's doctor confirmed in written records that at the time of signing, he was cognitively sound. Their entire theory rested on the claim that I had manipulated a vulnerable old man. But every piece of evidence pointed to the opposite. He had initiated the conversation about the house. He had contacted the attorney himself. His personal journal, which I submitted as evidence with his estate attorney's blessing, contained multiple entries expressing his deliberate intention to leave the house to me and his disappointment that my parents had checked out of his life. "They visit when they want something," one entry read. "My grandson shows up when I need something." When my attorney read that line in her office, she looked up at me and said, "This case is over. They just don't know it yet." But here's the thing about entitled people. They don't read evidence, they read leverage. And they had one more play left. My mother called me 3 weeks before the scheduled trial date. She had dropped the soft voice. "You really want to drag this family through a public trial? For a house? Is it worth it?" "You filed the lawsuit," I said. "We can still settle. Split it down the middle, you and us. You keep living there if you want. She said it like she was doing me a favor, like offering me half of what was entirely mine was a generous concession. No, I said. Silence. Then, you're going to regret this. I didn't say anything. I just let the silence sit. And then I ended the call and texted my attorney. They just threatened me. I'm keeping the voicemail. 3 weeks later, we walked into the courtroom. I had spent the previous month doing something my parents clearly hadn't anticipated. I went on offense. Not in the courtroom. Not yet, but in the documentation. I compiled a full financial accounting of every dollar I had put into that house. Roof replacement, $14,200. HVAC system, $8,400. Interior renovation, materials and labor, $11,000. Deck construction, $6,800. Total, just over $40,000 invested in 6 years, all documented with receipts, contractor invoices, and bank statements. My attorney filed a counterclaim. If the court was going to entertain a challenge to the property transfer, we were going to put on the table the question of restitution. If somehow the house was deemed subject to estate division, my $40,000 in documented improvements would need to be addressed first as a creditor claim against the estate. It was legally sound, strategically devastating, and it changed the math entirely. Their attorney had sold my parents on a vision of splitting the equity. The house was worth about $280,000 at that point. Divide 3 ways. They walk with over $90,000 each. What they hadn't accounted for was that once my $40,000 claim was on the table, the estate they were splitting shrank considerably, and that was before legal fees, which were mounting on their side considerably faster than mine because their attorney billed hourly at a premium rate. My father, I later found out, had taken a personal loan to fund the litigation. He had been so certain of a fast settlement or quick win that he had borrowed against it. When their attorney informed them about the counterclaim and revised the likely financial outcome, the atmosphere on their side apparently changed. I only know this because their attorney approached mine about settlement discussions the week before trial. The offer: drop everything, split legal fees, no hard feelings. My attorney called me with it. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "Nothing," I said. "We go to trial." She paused. "You know you'll win, but trials are unpredictable. It's your call." "They called my workplace," I said. "They fabricated a witness declaration. They lease-pendenced my grandfather's house. And then my mother called me and said I'd regret not settling. I want this on the record." Trial day was quieter than I expected. My parents sat at the plaintiff's table looking smaller than I remembered them. Their attorney was polished, but working with bad materials. My attorney was precise, calm, and methodical in a way that I found genuinely beautiful to watch, like watching someone dismantle a bad argument with a socket wrench. The estate attorney who had drafted the will and been present at the TOD deed signing testified. He described my grandfather as clear, deliberate, and fully informed at every meeting. He testified that my grandfather had contacted him, not the other way around, and had been unambiguous about his wishes. He also noted that my grandfather had specifically asked whether my parents could contest the arrangements and had been relieved to understand the robustness of the TOD deed structure. My grandfather had known they might try this. He had planned for it. When that landed, I watched my mother's face. Something moved through it, not guilt, exactly, but recognition. She knew he'd known. She'd always known. Their medical expert, hired to argue cognitive decline, was cross-examined using my grandfather's own medical records. the physician's notes, and the dated journal entries. It fell apart cleanly. Their neighbor witness had already been deposed into irrelevance. The undue influence narrative had no support that hadn't already been contradicted. The judge, direct, unhurried, clearly done with this case before it started, ruled from the bench. The TOD deed was valid. The will was valid. The property had transferred correctly and legally. The lawsuit was dismissed.
Costs were awarded to me.
That last part meant my parents were ordered to pay a portion of my legal fees. It wasn't the full amount, but it was real, concrete, official. Their attorney shook my attorney's hand. My parents walked out without looking at me. I sat in the courtroom for a moment after it emptied, just breathing. The court reporter was packing up her equipment and glanced at me. "Good day," she asked, making conversation. "Yeah," I said. "Good day." That wasn't the end of the story, though, because I wasn't done. The lawsuit had cost me real money in legal fees, real months of stress, and something harder to name, the complete erasure of any remaining illusion that my parents were acting in good faith. They had weaponized grief. They had recruited a neighbor. They had called my workplace. They had tried to take what my grandfather deliberately, carefully, and legally gave me. So I got to work. The $40,000 counterclaim hadn't been fully resolved by the dismissal of their case. It had been mooted by the outcome. But the documentation I had compiled was thorough and verified. I filed a separate small claims adjacent civil action for the documented improvements, specifically structured as unjust enrichment, the argument being that if they had succeeded in claiming any portion of the estate, they would have been enriched at my expense by improvements I funded. With the trial outcome in hand and my documentation airtight, their attorney advised them to settle immediately. They paid me $22,000. Not the full amount, but a negotiated settlement they accepted to close the matter. My attorney called it a good result. I called it rent on their delusion. But the better part came from something I had quietly set in motion 2 months earlier. While the litigation was ongoing, I had filed a formal complaint with the state bar regarding the fabricated neighbor declaration, specifically the question of whether their attorney had done adequate due diligence before submitting a declaration he should have known was unsupported. The bar investigation took several months. I wasn't expecting much. What I got was a formal letter of admonition issued to their attorney, a black mark on his professional record. Not disbarment, not suspension, but documented.
Public. Permanent.
When my father called me after the civil settlement, the first time he'd called in months, he didn't apologize. He said, "I hope you feel good about yourself." There it was. Even at the end, it was about my feelings being wrong. "I do," I said. And I meant it completely. My mother sent a text 2 weeks later. One line, "Your grandfather would be disappointed." I read it once, didn't respond, showed it to my attorney in case it was relevant to anything. She said it wasn't. I agreed. I still live in the house. The deck my grandfather sat on the night he told me he was leaving it to me, I added a pergola last spring. The kind of project he would have had opinions about. I'd have argued with him about the wood choice, and he'd have been right, and I'd have pretended to be annoyed about it. That's the part that doesn't resolve neatly. The grief doesn't. My parents made that worse, and they'll live with that or they won't, but it's theirs to carry. What I know is this: my grandfather knew exactly what he was doing when he planned this. He knew who might come for it. He built the legal structure carefully with a real attorney, documented and notarized and airtight. He protected it for me the same way I had protected him, by showing up, paying attention, and doing the work before anyone needed it done. That's the thing about entitled people. They assume the inheritance is theirs by default because they're family, because they're older, because they feel owed. They don't do the math on what other people invested. They don't read the room until the judge reads the ruling. My father borrowed money to sue me and lost. Their attorney got a bar complaint. They paid me $22,000 out of their own pockets. And I'm sitting on a deck my grandfather watched me build, in a house the court confirmed is mine, writing this out for strangers on the internet, because sometimes the story, ending good, doesn't feel real until you say it out loud. It's real. If this story gave you the same satisfaction it gave me living it, subscribe, because I've got a family with enough material to keep this channel running until I'm my grandfather's age.